Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you so much for joining here today. It is 11 a.m. local time here in Salt Lake City, so we are going to go ahead and kick it off. Again, this meeting is being recorded, so if at any time you want to go back and re-listen, or if you weren't able to attend, happy to have that there for you. I'm Domenic Darling. I'm going to be going over how to prepare for CIP-003-9, a few practical steps to meet these new vendor access requirements that are coming our way. Throughout this meeting, we're going to be going through a lot of information about kind of how we got here and a few of the different things, how we're going to do it going forward. Please do either hold your questions to the end or just put it in the chat to kind of keep my flow a little easier here today. Also, I'm going to turn off my video. I do a lot of kung fu with my hands when I am presenting, and I always find that a little distracting there also. So please do work with me on that one. So what are we going to go over here today? Well, first off, let's just start to dive right into it. I'm going to kind of start off with a little bit of the history of CIP-3-9, not really going into a lot of the whole NERC CIP world, just going to kind of focus on the CIP-3 world. From there, we're going to walk through the new additions to the standard and what they mean for your organization. Then we're going to cover some guidance for implementation. We're going to include some practical steps and considerations for you. It's going to ensure some clarity. We're going to try to define some NERC key terms. They're not definitions, they're just terms. Those terms being vendor and a little bit of remote access and kind of how they apply to these particular requirements. After that, excuse me, we'll outline the next steps you can take to prepare for compliance. And then we'll wrap up with some closing thoughts and open the floor for any questions. So really, we're less than a year away, April 1st, 2026. This is going to be effective and enforceable. And as we all know, the cybersecurity threats continue to evolve on the both scale and sophistication. As a result, NERC, or the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, developed and approved an update to the Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards, CIP-3-9. This revised standard is set to become enforceable on April 1st, 2026, introduced some important new requirements focused on securing vendor electronic and remote access to the low impact cyber systems. One of the other changes we won't really be talking about today is kind of in requirement one, and that is just having that plan or that policy be documented. That needs to be reviewed once every 15 calendar months. But that's just kind of the administration aspect of it, things you need to be signed off. The main guts of it is really around CIP-3-9. How do we get here? And historically, and around some current opinions, low impact assets were considered to pose minimal individual risk to the BES. There's been a lot of recent analysis done through different organizations, including NERC, that really showed some true risk lying with the potential collective impact. Basically, if multiple low impact assets are compromised simultaneously, particularly through remote access vectors, they can pose a significant threat. Basically, an attacker could potentially exploit a low impact system as an entry point to higher impact assets. Really just amplifies the risk across the BES, and kind of really what it means is going from that GO to the GOP. So if they get in one place, they can start moving their way within the system. That concern was a really big driving factor around the NERC Board of Trustees December decision in February 4th of 2021. There was a meeting, kind of started to initiate a comprehensive review of the low impact BES cyber systems and all the threats. The board of directors, the NERC staff, to work with the industry and the stakeholders to assess whether the current criteria was addressing all of these cybersecurity risks associated with these systems at that time, and of course the facilities that were housing them. They carried out this directive. NERC assembled the low impact criteria review team, or the LICRT, was a diverse group of cybersecurity and compliance experts, all from the different aspects of the industry. Unfortunately, I wasn't really included in that, but the team's goal was to evaluate the degree of the risk posed by the low impact cyber systems and determine if the existing standards were sufficient to mitigate those risks. Unfortunately, they weren't, and it was hard to say some of even the baseline practices now really meet the mark. So the team findings were published in a report that emphasized the critical insight. Individual low impact assets may not present significant risks in their own, but the aggregate impact of the coordinated cybersecurity risk across all of the assets did result in a serious consequential risk to the VES. The report that came out recommending updating the low impact criteria to strengthen controls around remote access to these systems. In November 2022, the NERC board finally accepted the report from the LRCRT and directed the Standards Committee to begin the process of addressing its recommendations. As a result, a standards authorization request was submitted and approved in March 2023, which paved the way of development of CIP-003-9. The CIP-003-9 reflects an evolving understanding of the risk, reinforces the need for stronger security practices around vendor remote access, even for systems once considered to be a lower risk. The implementation of the standards marks a significant step forward in the collective effort to secure the electrical grid against modern cybersecurity threats. Also, I want to include that there's already modifications to Dash 9 coming through different aspects, including some internal network monitoring. And we're going to chat about all that soon around all of these different versions that are going to be out in the future. Now, it's Project 2303, along with another project, and even has some CIP-15 stuff that's coming down the pipeline. Of course, that's a little more for different impact ratings. But it all kind of ties in each other. As we all know, virtualization is another big one that is getting done with all these projects. So there's a lot of moving parts. But what does this all mean for us right now? Well, on April 1st, 2026, let's not be the fools and let's get ahead of the game. I hope everyone understands my pun and the reference on that one. The main focus is going to be really the introduction of Section 6 here, which is establishing mandatory security controls around vendor remote access to the low impact cyber systems. This new section requires entities to develop and implement mechanisms for identifying, disabling, and monitoring vendor access. The security objective is pretty clear as mud with this one. It's going to reduce the risk of unauthorized access, enhance the overall cybersecurity posture of your bulk electric system. It's going to be done through really proactive access management, managing your users, who's coming in and out, and just having some oversight for your vendor management. How are you going to handle these people that are coming in and out, and making sure that it's there? Some of the ways you're going to comply with these new requirements, you need to take a methodical approach, kind of reviewing things as a whole. The first and most important step is to conduct a thorough review of your current remote access practices and how you're assessing how they will align with the expectations outlined in Section 6. This really includes analyzing the design and implementation of your firewall rules, your access control, very important, identity management, solutions that you haven't currently in place. What can you leverage now that you're already there? In many cases, really, you're going to be updating or enhancing what's going to be necessary in your environments where vendor remote access does exist, or it hasn't really been managed much in the past. So it's going to be kind of really easy for some, it's going to be challenging for others. But one of the key technical measures emphasized by NERC in all of these reports and the findings is the use of multi-factor authentication, in our world MFA, for the vendor remote access. This is really going to be a critical layer of our defense. It's going to help reduce the likelihood that the credentials can be compromised and allow for that unauthorized access. Everyone should be ensuring on any type of remote access, whether in the NERC world or any type of corporate world, ensuring this MFA is applied consistently across all of the board. And, that we're all kind of addressing these big things and just taking cybersecurity a bit seriously. Beyond these technical upgrades, the organizational coordination is going to play a vital role in achieving and maintaining compliance. NERC, us, everyone is strongly encouraging entities establish clear and consistent communication protocols with their vendors. A lot of the bigger worlds, you see this being done with your CIP 13 supply chain management, but in our low world, not so much with all of that, but do definitely take a look at it. Look at the scope, your duration, and approval process for all remote access sessions, set clear expectations and boundaries with your vendors, and this will help minimize the risk and ensure that all access is being justified, logged, monitored, such as it's kind of doing right now in Section 3. So just kind of keep those few things in mind, who you're working with and how it's being done. Before I can even really go on with what CIP-003-9 is going to be, I need to chat about what's coming in the future. And I have to say, trying to connect these dots and follow the path here is not only confusing to me, you're hearing a lot in those industries that are coming out going, oh man, there's multiple drafts going on. It's hard to kind of keep track. As you can see, I have on my slide deck here, we went from -9 to A to Y to 310 to CIP 311, CIP 312, maybe something in the future. But really, there's been multiple drafting teams working at different times on revisions to the NERC CIP 3-9. Is kind of creating this complex landscape of different versions and potential implementation paths. Project 2016-02 and 2023-04 were both modifying the CIP 3 standards. One was kind of looking at the virtualization, which led to the 3. And then, the approval of CIP 3-9 by FERC included the low impact supply chain kind of requirements for this vendor remote access. So again, the 2016-02 is focusing on added virtualization and other conforming changes. This work was all approved by NERC back in May of 2024, and then it became CIP 3-10. And then Project 2304, meanwhile, incorporated recommendations from the LICRT teams, CIP, like the recommendations from there in the CIP 3-9, and it had resulting in separate versions of CIP. So this is where things started getting a little weird and different, and all these other projects were kind of going on. And then from there, it also created CIP 3-12, which is just another draft that just came out, and it's merging all the changes from -10 and -11 together. To keep adding to this mix of the CIP modifications, the drafting team also posted its own version of the CIP 3-12, so it just kind of came out, it's a little new. They're not accepting comments on this just yet, but I would expect that to happen. So there's two new versions that weren't enough to keep track of. All of the entities now have CIP 3-9, 10, 11, and 12, and internal placeholders like CIP 3-Y and CIP 3-A. So it's a lot of things that kind of go and look at, and they're all posted on the respective teams' websites, NERC's websites, at various stages of the approval process. So there's a lot of choices, and depending on how you kind of feel towards this, it's one of those things where you can look at it as a little bit of progress to address all of these cybersecurity risks, or as a big source of all of the confusion on how you need to start looking towards the future with what all of these kind of go. But the least thing I can say is CIP 3, the -12 version may kind of bridge some of these gaps, but as we all know in the NERC world, who knows what's going to kind of happen and how long that may take. But really, we want to kind of just focus on -9 for right now. Excuse me. So I do want to add a little more clarification on the 2016-02's work that turned CIP 3-9 into CIP 3-10. It was modified on the same base to produce the CIP 3-11, and it was later drafted the CIP 3-12 to reflect that possibility of 10 and 11. These versions were posted alongside the corresponding implementation plans. A lot of information there, but the approval timeline is uncertain because of the 2016-02 being a part of the larger effort with 11 CIP standards that are out there and the multiple glossary term definitions that are coming. And while Project 2023-04 targeted the chances, the section attachment 1, it's really unknown which version is going to be approved first. Both are being maintained, so either can come forward depending on how the regulatory review plays out. So again, a lot of uncertainties of how it's going to go. We can look a little closely at the 2023-04, which is the modifications to CIP 3 drafting team, which is really kind of going into our work right now. It was kind of rooted again in those concerns around the development of CIP 13, which only applies to the medium high impact ES cyber systems. NERC and even additional staff throughout the ERO wanted these supply chain management requirements extended to the low impact systems, especially around the remote vendor access. And that's where we got CIP 3-9 in the response to that, improved by FERC in 2023. That has that enforcement date of April 1st, 2026. And it includes that new 6th section that we had in the last slide, which is requiring the entities to determine, disable, and detect remote access communications. So let's go back even further now, based off the CRT team's 2021 recommendations, adopted the project 2023 with further revised attachment 1 to move the vendor remote access language from section 6 to section 3. So again, we have what's coming to us next year, but then we can look forward, and where section 6 is coming, it's kind of going into section 3. It's going to help align with everything that the other electronic access controls are in place. The new language also added to require user authentication and protection of authentication information for remote access, kind of just managing the user itself and all types of remote access instead of just the vendor. Really, these revisions are going to be the foundation of CIP-003-11, because the new version of this also has full context of the CIP-003-9, the new controls, and it's expected that the CIP-003-9 will be implemented when FERC fully approves the -11 and 12, which will likely declare that -9 is superseded. So as you get -9 in there, you're going to have to kind of start looking forward that you're going to have to do some additional changes to really your documentation. But if you take some proactive approaches right now and just start addressing all access management or remote access management, I think you're going to kind of get a little bit of the curve there. And like say that the CIP-003-11 has just entered the first comment period last month, and it's going towards the balloting. A lot of different parts on how that process moves, but we can kind of be looking at both 4 ballots, maybe, as they're saying, maybe 6 to 18 months through FERC, and then the 3-year implementation requirements. So, hypothetically speaking, the CIP-003-9 is going to remain in effect for a few different years, so maybe about 5 to 6, or maybe a little less. And all the CIP modification drafting team has kind of been focusing on the integration of the virtualization. That's really important aspect here, is you want them to focus on this to allow these entities to be a little more cloud-based. So we are looking forward to that. As I mentioned earlier, these teams are also going to be responsible for that other version that's kind of coming out, which is the CIP-13-12, just kind of a virtualized version of CIP-003-11. So you can see is, yeah, we're eventually getting there. It's just going to be a little bit down the line. They also want all of those virtualization related standards to go in effect at one time, but that's going to be years away before we start to see that. But again, view CIP-11 as kind of the likely next enforceable version you can go for. So take a look at that. Is there any gaps you can kind of bridge in between to help you there? I also want to say is as you are working on these, that the only enforceable standard is the one in effect on April next year. That'll be -9. But whether that future one's down the future, -10, 11, or 12, and maybe even future versions like that, 13 or 14. But just pay attention to what is playing right now in our world at CIP-13. Excuse me, CIP-3-9, not CIP-13. Right, so let's continue on here. And this is, we're going to start having a little fun to talk about some of the things to do for implementation of CIP-3-9, Section 6. This really important step towards strengthening and maturing your security practice for your low-impact BES cyber systems. It points in many ways that the section closely mirrors some of the basic foundations of CIP-5. So if you already have some of those controls in place, you could take a look on those and how you're going to implement those same approaches as a bit of the starting point. They took certain aspects of there, or the risk of those aspects, and really kind of started bringing that forward. And that's what we can see in the low impact world there. So, good stuff in my sense of the means of good security practices and security posture that you may have at your organization. So for section 6.1, what are we going to be looking at for some of these things and how you can address it? Well, you're going to need to have some documentation and controls that are going to demonstrate or how the vendor access is pre-authorized. This is going to be your steps to take prior to granting that access. This is just similar to what your CIP-4. It's going to show whether the alerts are generated and when the vendor logs on, how the sessions are being monitored, whether the security information and event management systems, receipt systems are logging and alerting on those sessions. Additionally, you're going to have some stuff and documentation and controls that are going to cover how the sessions are initiated on a time-to-need basis rather than persistent access within and out. So basically, what we mean by that is having those vendors reach out to you and go through your access identity processes to allow them in the systems. So in addition to there, again, session recording you can have in place. So how are your logs being retained and reviewed? If other operational, procedural, technical controls are used, these should be kind of clearly identified in your plan as a part of the overall access control strategy you have. One of the cool things that they kind of started doing with the CIP-3 and a few other standards made it a little more security objective based instead of very prescriptive. So we have multiple ways to address these new standards kind of coming forward. But what I'm trying to say is if you document it in your CIP-3 plan, make sure you are doing that because they will hold your feet to the fire in the audit world. So for section 6.2, have some documentation to show how the vendor electronic remote access can be disabled. You can have a few different things here, including disabling user or system accounts, shutting down the ports, certain services, or accessing permissions on the systems, like utilizing your firewalls, router switches, VPNs, remote desktop, and any other tools used for remote access. And have some verbiage in there and some documentation to cover how disabling communication protocols, such as your IP, that would support the vendor the connections and communications. Now, in some cases, physical connectivity can also be removed, such as unplugging the Ethernet cable. But a lot in the world we deal in, these sites are very remote, so it could be there. It's like a disconnecting operational thing. You can also power down equipment too from the little bit of the manual side. But again, if you say you're going to do it in your plan, make sure you have it documented and that you will do it. Also have some documentation to include the administrative controls outlining procedures, tools, and the steps used for disabling access. So as I was saying, you'll hear me say again, if we list it down in our CIP-3 plan, make sure you're doing it. List all of those relevant operational procedures and technical controls on how to disable that access. Now for section 3, have something that's demonstrating and implement controls or technologies already in place or not in place to detect malicious communications. The use of anti-malware solutions, IDS, intrusion detection systems, or intrusion prevention systems, and either automated or manual log reviews can be conducted as you do have that little bit of that flexibility for the CIP standard, how you're doing that. Have documentation and be able to show how alerts are being generated in response to any suspicious activity. Look at your CIP cybersecurity or response plan, and if you have something detected and how that may kind of play into itself too, really your response to that suspicious activity. You definitely want to take a look at those and of course include any additional operational, procedural, and technical controls within your plan that help you respond to those potential threats. And, we kind of feel if you review and enhance all your controls that you have in place or implement some new ones and, really applying a lot of these proven security technologies, like that big important one, multi-factor authentication, and really just working with your vendors to have better collaboration, looking at your CIP-13 methodologies as you bring on new vendors. Are they going to be legit? How are they practicing? This will help you really meet the compliance requirements. But really what we really want to kind of drive home is improving your resilience against emerging cyber threats that are there and that kind of matter to our world and the grid. So this is a really tough one to kind of go over because it's not a NERC-defined term, and then CIP-13 technical rationale and justification gave us a little bit of help on what a vendor is. And I really want to put a big emphasis on this, that this is, again, not a NERC-defined term. So it's really hard to kind of figure out what it is. And I can tell you there's a lot of discussions in the EIRO and that have been going on for years through, different aspects, legal not lawsuits, but working with lawyers and what it really means. So the technical rationale kind of helps. It says that the term vendor, as used in the standard, is limited to those persons, companies, and other organizations with the responsible entity or its affiliates contract with the supply of the cybersecurity electricity systems and related services. I'm not going to continue reading on here, but it kind of gives you an idea what we're going to look at and what the term vendor might be. But again, it's really hard to kind of work with this. And how I kind of feel it, and I really want to put an emphasis on these are my thoughts towards it. And it's not a defined term. This is a little bit of my opinion. But what it really means, like as a NERC vendor, is referring to what any third party individual or organization that's providing a product or service to the NERC registered entity. And it may have electronic, physical, or logical access to that entity's BES cyber systems and all of their associated assets. So that's the way I kind of wrap my head around it. It's those third parties that are doing something that's related to the NERC and the generation to there. Again, not a defined term, kind of hard to identify what it is. But under the NERC's terms with it, and with the CIP world, and really in context of CIP-3, CIP-5, and CIP-3, vendors need these key considerations due to the risks that they introduce to the security of the bulk electric system. And what NERC, again, is kind of thrown out there in different little ways is that their vendor is an external to the registered entity. They provide products, software, services, or support. They may or may not have remote or on-site access to the best cyber systems, but most importantly, they have to be considered when implementing vendor risk management or remote access controls. So anything that they have to do with it, if they have remote access, they're working with supply chain management. It's anything that's kind of involved there, the way to good look at it. And when any of those people, those are the ones that we want to target and make sure that they have those strong security practices in place. So we kind of have a little bit of idea with the vendor remote access and what it looks like. And again, still a lot of discussions in the ERO, even within myself internally, what that means, and within our team on kind of how it goes. Now, let's kind of dive into the remote access. Just like the vendor, there's a lot of discussions that are going on in the context of what it means to the NERC world. It really kind of refers to the ability of a person to access the BES cyber systems or associated within a location from the outside or in. The standard and a lot of the documentation out there really lists it to being the outside, but there's already some discussions in the ERO that are happening about internal type connections. Hopefully they come out with some documentation and some guidance practices for us to kind of get some clarity that kind of goes in there. And I think that'll be really helpful on what this is all defining, what remote access is. And there's also chats about the additional data acquisition type remote access in there too. So again, so much coming out, a lot of things that are not clarified, and we're hoping to get some guidance and recommendations for them, different areas to kind of help us there too. Because I kind of consider moving on here to just really high level of what remote access can kind of take on two primary forms. Obviously, your interactive remote access, that's your kind of human coming from the vendor that's connecting to the system, using tools like VPN, remote desktop, SSH to perform those tasks. And then, the system to system type access where, they're just coming in, connecting to what they need to do, hopefully through a VPN now. And this is where it's all going to kind of come together later on as you are looking at what you have out there and who has access, how do they have access, what's going on there right now. So why does it all matter? Of course, the standards like CIP-3, 5, and 13 is again, as I was talking a few slides ago, a lot of these are considered high risk vectors for the cybersecurity threats. And, really what NERC wants to bring home and what's going to be required, controlling remote monitor access, looking at your implementation of authentication mechanisms using multi-factor, logging and alerting the active sessions, disabling the access, and really ensuring your vendors are being managed if they have remote access and they're applying and they're going through all those proper steps. So to kind of just tie this together and really in short is it's, neither is a remote access or vendor access or really a vendor, what is defined, not in our terms, hopefully in the future. What I kind of look at it as really any type of external electronic connections to the cyber systems if you have those type of connections out there in your world, secure them, monitor and manage these, and it's really going to accomplish a little bit of this ambiguity around these non-NERC defined terms that we have here, and it's really just going to help kind of protect your cybersecurity systems from any threats. Again, a lot of discussions what these all mean, but I think to all be safe, if there's any type of remote access communications going on with any vendor or even internally, protect it. I think that's a really good business practice we can all use going forward there. Right, so let's kind of go over some of our next steps here, and to kind of keep this high level when you be working with a lot of your IT departments, asking a lot of these same questions of what we're going to need to do here, and to kind of cover what's in CIP-003-9 and a little bit with the forward future motions down the line. Let's just kind of consider some of these type of things that we can ask ourselves to help better understand the current situation that you have on your systems and really identify any potential gaps as you prepare for the compliance with Section 6. So let's elaborate a little further on this. Everybody, every GO, DOP, well, everybody applicable, a registered entity, really regardless of your size, your age, or complexity, and anyone who's working with a third party to provide the network security for those entities. And this is definitely including those security vendors that do the type of network and the monitoring for registered companies. This is really going to be some questions to ask on how you evaluate and understand where your remote access exists. So, do we all know where our vendors are connecting from? Do we have the ability to control or revoke that access? Going forward, new vendors should go through a bit of a formal approval process, maybe a little bit of check mark and a checkbox to look at some rules that could be created to help authorize their access. Help guide their evaluation. And by doing this, again, with a company maybe having a checklist, you can ask yourself some of these questions that we have listed up here and really kind of dive into a little bit of that. Do vendors at your company have access to your low impact BES cyber systems? Are they going through remote access through these systems, either interactive system to system remote access? So really start to look at the big picture with there. Who's coming in? What are they doing there? Why are they going to be there? Are you provisioning these people, and how are you managing these individuals here today? Have you just allowed for it to come in and out? Can you step back and take a look at what you need to do? Do you have any existing controls in place that are helping you identify and manage these remote access? Be able to provide any details on those too, and look at what you can currently already leverage in your world right now by doing this to kind of tell the story of, oh, hey, we already have these things in place. Now it's just going to be, capturing it from a compliance standpoint and doing a little more on the end to make sure that it's all done. You look at your existing controls too, of course, if your identity managed to make sure that it's happening. And as I'm saying, looking at what you have in there for your tools, that can include your kind of remote monitoring software that can really look and report any of those sessions that are being connected. So you can kind of see if you already have some of these tools here, you can, start working in your plan and use those to help you meet the compliance. And it's going to be really good. So, as a lot of these systems are built out, they've already been used in there. So now it really kind of comes down to just making that work for NERC compliance. And some other questions to ask. Do you know what cyber assets are the part of the low impact cyber systems that have remote connectivity? This is a really fun one in our world because CIP-2 doesn't say you need to have a discrete list. But of course, if you don't know what that discrete list is from CIP-2, how do you know what's protecting? And to elaborate even further, if you don't have that list of all your assets there, how do you even know what has that remote connectivity? So you definitely need to step back and take a look at what you have out there and what may allow for that remote connectivity. Do you have any projects planned between now and April 26th? That's going to kind of have a little bit of creation if they're going to need remote access. Being sure to look at those and have that hat on looking forward on what you're going to need to do for those. As that time date that comes up, you'll have it there working for you. So, while you're looking at the future, let's pay some extra special attention to the past and really regarding a lot of these legacy SCADA systems that are out there and how the remote access to that SCADA system is being provided. I had a great conversation yesterday kind of around just that, and some of these old systems were maybe configured with some old practices there. So if you do have any of those going out there, put those under the microscope because they may have some additional scrutiny as you go forward that might not be quite meeting the mark, as some of these remote access to the SCADA systems were set up not incorrectly in the past, just not going to be good for the future forward. So definitely take a look at all those old systems out there too. Put those ones under there. Again, look at what controls are helping you identify to detect and prevent any type of remote access and what those comms may kind of have coming in and out. Assume if your firewalls are in place, look at those firewalls, look at the rules and the plan rules that you have already in there to help you determine the remote access. And of course, if you don't have any firewalls in place, definitely indicate that right away and start planning to put some of those in and how are you going to kind of control that access. Look at if your network traffic right now is being monitored. What can you do to take a look at that and kind of review and analyze for section 6.3 and how it's going to use it. See if you don't need one already, if you already do, any type of intrusion detection system or an IPS that you have in place, and what those are currently doing and how that can help you in the future too. So if you do have some of those systems there, it might just be looking at it, working with your departments to figure out, hey, how can we better leverage this to meet the CIP-003-9 objectives? Look at, of course, everything as a big whole too, and what other cybersecurity best practices you already have in place that can be leveraged for this. As I've been saying before, your access management, provisioning, revoking access, a lot of entities that already have the medium and high impact world can look at a lot of the CIP-4 practices and kind of how they're bringing people in through there. So, look at the big picture of it. Goes with, identifying remote access, comes 5, you get some CIP-7 with the malicious communications, and of course, is disabling remote access too. So there's kind of a lot to kind of go in there. But, as I always like to say, just look at everything as a whole, start asking yourselves these questions on what you need to do to kind of sell the story and what you need to happen. And it really goes without saying, if you haven't started this process already, it really needs to start real soon because it's going to come up quick. And if you're not addressing these things now, or you have some systems in place, they're simply not going to do it. I think we're going to run into some issues as that does come up, and your ability to meet the objectives of CIP-3-9, and of course, even more forward looking with all of the new standards that are going to kind of happen. All right, I just kind of want to touch on some closing thoughts here before we kind of move on to some Q&A. A few different things I want to focus on that's not really outlined in the standard, a little bit off the cuff, is really training and awareness for your staff, for your vendors, and everybody internal, and really a part of your implementing CIP-3-9. It's really to ensure that all the personnel that are going to be involved have received training on all of these, the approvers, the one using it, so on. Really, those that are kind of involved with the vendor remote access, understand the expectations for managing, monitoring, and disable the access in the alignment with Section 6 of the standard. Make sure the personnel responsible for cybersecurity and operations and the system administration are really well versed in the technical and procedural aspects of these controls. Have your training cover not only general compliance objectives, CIP compliance objectives, but really the steps required to disable the vendor remote access as, if something does happen. That's one of those key things that you're going to need to do is go in there and say, how can we cut this off right away? Because if there's really an event of a security concern or any of the operational needs, that's one definitely important thing. Have your staff be knowledgeable, your organization be knowledgeable how to maintain the security operations, and of course, demonstrate compliance with these evolving regulatory landscapes that we all work in. Another one is, vendor communications. As you kind of transition to CIP-3-9, if you haven't already, start looking at all of the changes, communicate that with the vendors. Vendors should be acknowledging these responsibilities under new requirements, especially those related to the ones having the remote access and the security controls, involved with some formal updates to your contract, your SLAs, or other binding documents to kind of reflect their role in maintaining compliance, from their end, that they are going to always use MFA and so on. So, different things, really working with your vendor, and to make sure that everybody kind of has a clear understanding of what's happening. And again, confirm with them that they do have an understanding of their obligations, to that too, to make sure that everything's going to be good going forward. And I always like to say too is, if you're going through these processes and you're starting or not, get the warm and fuzzies. If you don't trust them, control them. Put some equipment in place to make sure that, and such as CIP-003-9 is doing, to make sure that they're good to go. Lastly, demonstrate compliance. As you're kind of going down and meeting the security objective, there's always that additional level of being able to explain your implementation and all your efforts. So as you prepare to kind of meet these security objectives, compete, keep in mind that the security and the compliance there. Consider things like how you're going to demonstrate and verify compliance in the means of an audit, spot check, evaluate and identify the preventive, detective, and corrective controls, internal controls that you kind of have in place to manage the electronic remote access. You should determine what is triggering these events, like onboarding a new vendor or granting new access, making modifications to any of your system that's going to kind of require any review or changes to your either process, your plans, and really just kind of having that clear plan for ongoing validation adjustments is really going to be key here, and just kind of forward future looking hat. Again, can't explain that enough, how you're going to kind of go through there. And with all of these future mind, with all these upcoming changes to CIP-3, XYZ, 1, 2, 3, just look at the bigger picture with all of this and start putting these controls and systems in place to authenticate all users going to these low impact systems. Really put stuff in for multi-factor authentication, because as you can see with all of these develops in the standard, that's where it's kind of going to. It's not just going to be vendor, it's going to be just remote access that's kind of going through. Really happy with seeing all of these changes do come, even though there's a lot of confusion on what is going to be either around the terms that are being used, all of the standards that are coming out, how it's all passing in, the virtualization products. But we do feel that, these updates in CIP-3-9 really does reflect kind of the growing need for stronger, more consistent controls around remote access to the cyber systems in general. It's really a good proactive effort to enhance the cybersecurity posture of our systems. And this isn't just from the NERC CIP level. Also consider it from your own perspective on how important to have these controls in place to make sure we're operating correctly. And as again, as you move towards the implementation, it really depends on your planning, your preparation, and the integration of everything you learned by those questions that you had before. And, making sure these effective security practices, burn into your existing CIP programs. What I kind of mean by that is, a CIP program, it is a mile wide and an inch deep. There's been ways they were trying to improve that, but the idea was, companies would go and take that inch and go in a little deeper. So, the things that you have in place now that really doesn't reflect much of the CIP world, consider those as a part of your overall plan on how you're really meeting security objectives and, providing operational and secure grid. Really embrace these changes. Let's forget about the compliance requirement, but really contribute to the secure, resilient, and future-ready energy infrastructure that we all need here. We don't want our power to go out or anything. So again, consider all of these things that we hear say today as a little bit of a bigger picture, moving on from a little bit of the CIP-3 world. So that is what I have for you here today. We have about 15 more minutes left. We'll hang on and answer any questions that you may have. And I do appreciate your time here today and hope you found this beneficial.
Yeah, and as a reminder, we do have a survey linked in the chat. If you guys can take a quick moment to fill that out, that'd be really appreciated. We love to get feedback, and this will be posted to our YouTube channel. And I'm gonna give you guys permission to unmute. Duke, it looks like you raised your hand.
Yeah, hey, so thanks for this presentation. Um, are you prepared to like maybe respond to a specific situation out there with regards to who is considered a vendor? Is this a good forum for that?
Yeah, well, I can provide my opinion if you do on what the vendor is, but it really what makes it difficult in my world and not being on the regulatory side is, one, we don't really have teeth on what that kind of defines too, especially with NERC and, with different people having a little bit of different opinions on what it really means. If we go back to one of my slides here, and again, I put emphasis on a little bit of my opinion versus what's NERC's opinion on this and what the vendor is you can kind of see it's anybody that is really involved with working on what the BES cyber systems is. I really want to put an emphasis on is what your organization, what other organizations look at this, and where we can turn to NERC and say, hey, give us something clear and consistent. And they always kind of come back and give us not exactly what we need. So it's hard to give you the exact answer to it beyond
Well,
what we can kind of
I
provide
guess
here.
I'd still love to have your opinion. And I'll give you the scenario. So on a site with DMZ set up on the network and an appliance
Mhm.
out there with streaming data to that appliance over that's sitting in that DMZ, and then that data being streamed off the site, would that be considered remote access with a read-only connection coming into the DMZ from the system?
And is it's constantly feeding the data up, or is there somebody initiating outside to go in and get that information?
Constant.
Constant, not exactly right now, no, but I can't speak for every type of auditor that's out there looking at that, and that may change. As I was doing some research into the CIP-003-9, I did hear some discussions about the system-to-system connections that are out there. What it means to me, no, not exactly. What I always try to keep in mind with this remote access is there's somebody physical there, kind of clicking a button that's going in there and doing it. Yeah, so I think it's going to be case by case scenario and how everything's kind of, configured in architecture there now. I wish we had more information to provide you on that. That's coming from NERC. Hopefully, we do get something before April 1st, 2026, so we make sure that we are protecting those right things on what's considered as remote access. Because we're kind of hearing both. We're all a little scared. We really need something to come soon.
Fair
And
enough.
it's
Thank you.
yeah, it's kind of the same where some of these same discussions about where it's being initiated from, and it's always this kind of like, oh well, we're still discussing it. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I'll hang out for a few more minutes for any questions. Otherwise, I really do appreciate everyone's time. My email address is here below. If you ever did have a question, feel free to reach out to us over here at GritSme. We love chatting about this stuff and being able to provide. And so we're always here to kind of work with you on whatever you guys have any questions kind of around that. There's a lot of things pivoting and moving right now, and what we're getting and hearing without the discussions, we're hoping to get the clarity too, because we're very well involved with this, and we want to make sure that everything is getting done right.